and welcome to the ConfigMgr Technical Preview Podcast. I'm your host, Nathan Zenert. As always, you can catch me on Twitter at TheZnerd. This episode of the podcast is going to cover Technical Preview Release 2005, and I've got to admit it is probably one of my favorite releases so far. So many new features, so many cool features, and the cool news is you might not have to wait until ConfigMgr 2006 to see some of these features. More on that later though. If you want to be notified about new videos, feel free to subscribe to the channel or just watch my Twitter. I post all of the videos there as well, whatever is easier for you. Let's not waste any more time, let's get into my top 3 features. I'm going to cheat a little bit with the first one. It's actually 4 different ones in the documentation, but they all relate. It's additions to the Tenant attach feature within ConfigMgr, and more specifically adding 4 new features within the Microsoft Endpoint Manager Admin Center. If you're on ConfigMgr 2002 and you haven't enabled Tenant attach yet, do it.
Do it! Don't let your dreams be dreams.
I'm totally serious about this. If you joined us from MeMug about a week and a half ago, I talked about the Tenant attach feature in ConfigMgr 2002, and I talked about how MeMac, or the Admin Center, is going to become kind of that single pane of glass where you're managing devices. And honestly, you don't have to take my word for it. Look at what Rob York says.
Make your dreams come true. Just do it.
2 key things to take away from that, obviously, are the Admin Center is the ConfigMgr console, and number 2, you might see some features in the Admin Center that you don't get in the console at a future date. So if you haven't Tenant attached, get that change request in and enable it. Now, about 30 seconds ago, I mentioned you're going to be able to enable some of these technical preview features before the next current branch release of ConfigMgr, which will likely be 2006, definitely not 2007 for obvious reasons. My understanding is that when these features are enabled, you will have to opt into them in your ConfigMgr console, but all of the underlying code necessary to handle this work is already built into ConfigMgr 2002. So if you're on 2002 and you've got that Tenant attach enabled, you've got new features coming to you before the next ConfigMgr release. The first of these new features is the device timeline in the Action Center. You're going to be able to capture some events that will help you troubleshoot your clients, things like application errors, unknown shutdowns, boundary group changes, etc. There's a whole list available in the technical preview documentation. These events are going to be summarized to the Admin Center once per day, and they are retained for a period of 30 days. As with all things data capture related, your security team would probably be pretty upset if you didn't notify them about this new form of data gathering from your environment being uploaded into the cloud. So you do have to enable the endpoint analytics data collection option, and the client does have to receive the policy from client settings before data is going to be captured on the device. First, let's take a look at what the timeline looks like. Now, when this feature is released to production, you'll be able to access this directly from the Admin Center. However, for us technical preview users, we do need to open up the Assets and Compliance blade, select Devices, and then right-click on a device that we want to look at. And we're going to start our Admin Center preview. This is going to open up a web browser, and you may be asked to log in. If you haven't, I already have. And then we're going to select, once this loads, timeline feature, and you'll notice we've got some informational and error messages in here as well, and these summarize, again, the list is available on the technical preview documentation, but it summarizes information like shutdowns and reboots, or errors related to applications. And you can see here we've got an issue with the SCCM RDP system application closing unexpectedly, and I initiated a reboot. Again, this data, don't forget, is only going to summarize once a night, so don't expect to see data as it comes in, but this can be a helpful tool when you're trying to investigate issues with machines, or even be proactive about repair and servicing your users. Like I mentioned before, we do have to enable data collection for these devices, and to do that, we're going to come into our administration blade here, open up client settings, and we'll just select the default client settings for this environment, select properties, and computer agent, and down at the bottom we'll see this new option, Enable Endpoint Analytics Data Collection, and we want to make sure that is set to yes for that data collection to happen. The next addition to the Admin Center is the ability to install applications from the Admin Center to devices. Now for this feature to work, we do have to enable the optional feature in ConfigMgr for Approve Application Requests for Users per Device. That's not enabled by default in your environment. So make sure if you want to use this feature, you do enable that. My guess as to the reason behind this is that it's using some of the underlying APIs that you would normally use with the approving application requests to facilitate the installation of the application to the device. Additionally, it must be a device-targeted application, and you do have to deploy it to a collection that the device belongs to, requiring administrator approval. So this is an available deployment requiring administrative approval. So open our software library, take a look at the application, call this definitely not BitLocker, and let's take a look at the deployments for this. We open up our all desktops and server clients collection deployment. You'll notice here that under our deployment settings, it is install available and an administrator must approve the request for this application on the device. Scheduling isn't going to matter in this case as long as it is available. And for notifications, we're going to go ahead and show all for the user so they can know we're installing BitLocker on their device. We'll open up the Admin Center again and pull up the Applications blade. And we should see this application listed now. If we click it and choose Install, this should initiate the installation on the device. And if we open up this device, we should eventually see that application install on this workstation. We'll give this a few seconds to run. All right, and you notice that new software is available, new software was installed in this case. We got all of our notifications that came in, and we've got this lovely BitLocker file on our desktop. Why would you install this? And I'll say it again, if you're not yet using Tenant Attach, make sure you are enabling it because these features are going to be coming at you fast. We're going to cover the remaining two features in one fell swoop because they're both kind of based on the same underlying technology, and this is cmPivot from the Admin Center and also the Run Scripts feature from the Admin Center. Both of these features are going to have some additional requirements. cmPivot is going to require the latest version of the ConfigMgr client be installed, and both of them are going to require some version of PowerShell to be installed at varying levels 3 through 5, depending on which features you're looking to go with. If your environment can support it, just go with PowerShell 5 or 5.1 and be done with it. And parameters are not yet supported for the scripts feature. I suspect that will come in a future release, but for now, you have to use parameter-less scripts. Back in the Admin Center, you probably noticed these two options. We've got cmPivot and scripts. We'll take a look at cmPivot first. From here, I can type in any cmPivot query that tickles my fancy. If I type in BIOS here and hit run, within a reasonable amount of time, we should receive the results from this cmPivot query. Remember, we're going over the internet into the ConfigMgr environment and initiating cmPivot from that environment. And yep, you'll see we've got our BIOS information from this particular device. So again, super cool. You can now run cmPivot from the web, and it actually does work from your phone. I did test this. I don't have the ability or an easy ability to screen record my phone, unfortunately, so I can't show you that demo, but I do promise that it does work. And when you do have this feature in your MeMac tenant, you'll be able to do it from your phone if you so desire. The same thing goes for scripts. Scripts are basically immediately available as well. I did test this. I created a script, went straight into the Admin Center and refreshed the view, and the script was available. The underlying technology that's bringing this info in is allowing it to auto-update. So you're not really actually uploading the scripts. It's just Admin Center reaching into your environment and saying which scripts are available for me to run. If we click on the script and click Run Script, it's going to do exactly what we expect it to. It's going to initiate the run of that PowerShell script on the device, and eventually we will get the output from that script. We'll give that a few seconds to run. All right, you'll notice that the script has succeeded on this device. We don't have any information available here, but if we close that back out and reopen it, we get the output from that script. And in this case, I was just running a simple getSim instance and the Win32 physical disk, or sorry, Win32 disk drive class. So not super useful for me in this case, but it does show you that we can get script output back into the admin center. Next on the list is task sequence support for cloud-based media. We are one step closer to being able to image devices over the internet. It would be pretty slow, but in this work from home environment that many of us are living in, it maybe isn't the worst idea to be able to reimage a machine and fix it for a user. Sadly though, in this release you still do need an internet connection to your management point to facilitate this communication. However, for your environments or locations that don't have a local distribution point, and instead of taxing the WAN link, you could now grab content from a cloud distribution point instead. Now I'd really like to show you this feature. Unfortunately, I spent all my Azure credits on a different cloud management gateway environment, so I can't. However, Niall Brady does have you covered, and I will post a link to his post on this feature so that you can see it in action and some of his reasonings for why you might want to enable this feature when it is released. Rounding up my top 3 features for Technical Preview 2005 is the Community Hub and GitHub. Now this is phase 1 in a long-term strategy for Microsoft regarding the use of the Community Hub. In this phase, you will only be able to receive Microsoft curated content. However, the long-term goal is for content creators to be able to add things to the Community Hub, and I think there was a word about that content being curated by Microsoft or being able to opt into uncurated or unreviewed content as well. If I remember correctly too, at one of the conferences there was mention of the potential, at least in the long-term strategy, for private or internal GitHub repos to be able to be attached to the Community Hub. So we'll see if that happens in the long-term strategy, but at least for phase 1, we're getting some content in here. This release of the Community Hub does require you access it from a Windows 10 based device. I did try to access it from a server, and this could obviously pose problems for environments where maybe you're using a shared jump box to access the console. Definitely a feature that I'll be requesting in Microsoft that be enabled for servers, because although we shouldn't be accessing the console directly from a primary site server or a CAS, it does happen. And like that scenario that I mentioned about jump boxes or jump hosts, especially in a remote desktop services environment, that could potentially pose problems for those environments as well. Now the Community Hub is going to support PowerShell scripts, reports, task sequences, applications, and configuration items. To access the Community Hub, we're going to open up the Community blade and then select Community Hub, and you will notice that this is going to connect to a GitHub repo that is provided by Microsoft, and we'll have a few different items in here that we can download. And if we just download this script, configure edge auto updating, and hit download, this is going to download it directly into our console. And if we come back over to our software library and scripts, we should now have that script downloaded and imported. But you'll notice that the author is actually the person who imported it, not the person who created it in the GitHub repo. Now, the thing you have to be careful about, at least in this release, is if we go ahead and delete this script and come back into the Community Hub and open up that script again, we have no easy way, it appears, to download the content again. This is kind of unfortunate. Even if we select the Your Downloads section, again, no option to re-download, no right-click, no context menu. This is feedback that I did submit to Microsoft. I think we do need to have an easy way to re-download the content if we accidentally delete it from our environment. So that covers my top 3 features. Let's talk about the rest. Obviously, things are a little bit different in working conditions now. We've talked about this before, and it generally means that more of your users are accessing their systems using VPN. Now, in the past, you might define a boundary group based on IP ranges, but this can sometimes be complicated when it comes to VPN ranges or subnets, because maybe they are not well defined, or there's a few different networks, or maybe there's some overlap potentially in like a subnet. Who knows the potential configuration issues with trying to define a VPN boundary. But now we have the ability to create a boundary specific to VPN devices. Now this does require the latest version of the client, so make sure you're updating your workstations and servers with the client, and also updating your boot image. Your boot image needs to be updated to get the latest version of the client to support this boundary. If we right click on boundaries and create boundaries, you will see under type we have a new selection for VPN. You don't actually define any properties in here because this actually just comes from information provided by the ConfigMgr client to define whether the computer is on a VPN or not. If you follow this link here, at least in technical preview, it just takes you to the base documentation for ConfigMgr. We can give the VPN boundary a name, and we can add it to a boundary group if we prefer. And clicking OK, it's as simple as that. Now, all clients that connect through a VPN are going to belong to the boundary group that this boundary is attached to. I don't know how exactly things are going to play out if you have overlapping boundaries in this case, but my assumption is that the VPN boundary is actually going to take precedence over anything else. So something to be aware of. Make sure, again, you should never have overlapping boundaries in your environment, and if you do,
Nothing for you!
Additionally, the VPN detection logic may vary from provider to provider. Microsoft has covered a lot of bases here, but they haven't probably covered all of them. So if you're having problems with the VPN boundary, make sure that you submit a frown to Microsoft and give some details about your environment so that they can work to improve that detection logic. If you've been using the Cloud Management Gateway in an environment where, say, your devices are connected to your internal network, but you're forcing content through the Cloud Management Gateway, you probably noticed that there was an issue trying to get user-based deployments. In Technical Preview 2005, this is now resolved, so Software Center will now use your Azure AD identity for the device that's joined to Azure AD to authenticate through the Cloud Management Gateway, rather than attempting to use the Windows credential for the user who is attempting to get user-based deployments. If you've been having issues with your ConfigMgr client staying up to date on devices that are on metered network connections, this is no longer going to be an issue. For those unaware, previously when you had a device on a metered network connection and you tried to install the client, it would actually not install, and upgrades were also blocked if you didn't enable all client communications. Starting in Technical Preview 2005, clients are now going to be able to install and upgrade when you set the client communication on metered connections to allow in the client settings. Additionally, there's now a new parameter for CCM setup called allow metered, which will allow a device to install the ConfigMgr client over a metered connection. If you choose to reinstall the client on a device that already has it, it's going to prioritize whether or not it allows metered connections based on the existing client local policy, the last command line stored in the registry, and then parameters on the CCM command line. So make sure that if you do want to do this, you are enabling that feature in advance of the client becoming so broken it can't receive that client settings policy. If you know me, you know I like automating things with PowerShell, and in the Technical Preview 2005 release, we have some new commandlets and improvements to commandlets for managing your cloud management gateways. Now you can automate the entire process of creating a cloud management gateway from start to finish. First, you're going to create the applications. If you want to do this with PowerShell, you'll need to use the Azure commandlets to do that. Next, you'll import those applications that you created using the import cmAAD server application and import cmAAD client application commandlets. Then you're going to use git cmAAD application and pipe that to new CM Cloud Management Azure Service to create the service connection point. Then you'll run new CM Cloud Management Gateway to actually create the gateway. And finally, or you can do this before, you'll use add CM Cloud Management Gateway connection point to create the actual connection point in your environment for the Cloud Management Gateway. So if you're automating ConfigMgr builds for an environment, say you work for a managed services provider, you'll now be able to automate the Cloud Management Gateway portion of this as well. As we all know, Microsoft loves renaming things. I mean, who doesn't love renaming their children on a yearly basis? I go to the courthouse every year to take care of this. If you haven't been following the news, Office 365 Pro Plus has now been renamed to Microsoft 365 Apps, because that's not confusing at all. Not only did Microsoft choose to change the name of Office, but they also chose to change the name of the update channels as well. So in the ConfigMgr console, they do respect this name change. It is now visible as Microsoft 365 Apps, and there is also a banner message that will be shown in your console if you have automatic deployment rules that reference the old channel names, just to remind you that you do need to update those channel names to get updates going forward. If you have issues updating ConfigMgr to the latest current branch release, it doesn't happen often, but If it does, you now have the ability inside of the ConfigMgr console to report this issue to Microsoft. In the technical preview release, this is always going to be enabled, but for the current branch release, this will only be enabled if there are stated errors. And if we click this button, we're going to get a whole host of logs, option to put an email address in for contact about the feedback, and any additional information that you want to provide about the potential issue. I'm not going to submit this because I had no problems updating a technical preview. Rarely ever have issues updating to different versions of ConfigMgr. Just know though that Microsoft's got your back, and report those issues if you have them so they can improve the process going forward. The next improvement is really simple. If you have an Azure AD application secret that's about to expire, you're going to receive notifications about that expiration so that you can be proactive and renew that secret key before it expires. When you manage BitLocker within a task sequence, we all know that if you're changing the encryption method, you generally have to set a registry key in advance of running the step to make sure that that encryption method is used. No longer is that the case with Technical Preview 2005. Inside of the task sequence steps for Enable BitLocker and Pre-Provision BitLocker, we now have a disk encryption mode available to us. It's important to note that if you select an encryption algorithm that isn't supported by the OS, it will fall back to the OS default. So it's not going to fall back to the next highest level available, it will just fall back to the OS default. If you're using PowerShell to manage these task sequence steps, you do have a new parameter called encryption method. And additionally, on the enable BitLocker step, you do have the option to now skip this step for devices that do not have a TPM or if the TPM is not enabled. Previously, when using the content library cleanup tool, it would delete orphaned content from your environment. However, if you had orphaned records inside of WMI, it would not handle those, and you would need to remove those manually if you desired. I know at least a handful of people have probably screwed up their environment trying to do it manually. You no longer have to do this manually anymore. The content library cleanup tool does this for you when you run the tool with the delete parameter. If you've ever done Windows 10 in-place upgrades with ConfigMgr, like for feature updates, you notice that stupid command prompt window that shows up as the out-of-box experience after the upgrade is complete, and then your user accidentally clicks it and the upgrade fails out. In Technical Preview 2005, you don't have to worry about that anymore. Setup complete template.command and setup rollback template.command have changes made so that that window is no longer visible. That's going to wrap things up for this episode of the Technical Preview podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. If you've got any comments or suggestions, please leave them down below. If you've got a feature that I didn't show a preview of, I know I didn't show a lot of previews this episode, please feel free to also leave that in the comments and I'll try to hit that in a follow-up video if necessary. But until we meet again, happy adminning.